Alrighty, up next is Allison, and she's going to be talking about sex, love, and relationships among women living with HIV.
My colleague Marguerite was in her mid-30s when she was diagnosed with HIV. She was newly married at the time with a partner who was HIV negative. Today, at 60 years young, she is still in that relationship and her partner is still HIV negative. The image that you see in the background here is from a French HIV awareness campaign that revealed one of the most brilliant scientific revelations of our time. People living with HIV have a lot to share. They can't share HIV. That's because HIV treatment, which reduces the virus to undetectable levels, effectively prevents HIV transmission. While the primary aim of this medical strategy is to reduce sexual risk, I also believe it can help people regain their sexual lives. I do feminist quantitative research on sex and love with women living with HIV in Canada. That is, I use surveys in order to advance women's equality and rights in the intimate domain, including not just freedom from harm, but also the right to a satisfying sexual life. In my thesis, I set out to discover two things. First, what does sexuality look like for women living with HIV? And second, how does society shape and influence its expression? To do this, my team and I hired and trained 40 women living with HIV across Canada to conduct surveys with more than 1,400 of their peers. Our most striking finding was how diverse women's sexuality was. Some were satisfied without sex, others enjoyed an active sex life. In fact, 1/4 of all women in our study were in long-term happy and loving sexually active relationships defined by high intimacy and equal power, most commonly with HIV-negative partners. These relationship dynamics not only resulted in the most satisfying and pleasurable sexual experiences, but also better physical and psychological well-being. On the other hand, sexism, violence, stigma, and depression were just some of the societal factors associated with HIV that put a damper on the deed for other women. People think women's sexual pleasure is not important. That's especially true for women with HIV, whose sexuality has been historically constructed as a source of public concern rather than personal pleasure. We have an opportunity to change that. HIV is a treatable, manageable, and preventable condition, much like diabetes. A positive approach to sex that is grounded in human rights is vital to overcoming stigma and promoting women's equality, empowerment, and health. It's time we rethink our prejudices so that my colleague Marguerite and the millions of women like her can live in dignity. Thank you.
Alrighty, does anyone question right there?
If you're doing surveys where people are self-reporting their behavior, is there not a tendency when you're dealing with very emotional issues or issues that have stigma attached that people will not necessarily report factual data?
That's a great question. So what this gentleman is speaking to is social desirability bias. The idea that people might over-report perhaps behaviors that are more socially acceptable, particularly behaviors like sex and HIV that are not just stigmatized but criminalized in our society. I believe that in hiring women living with HIV as peer research associates on our study to facilitate these interviews with their peers would help to reduce that bias. So another great question. So our survey included 8 sections on multiple dimensions of health, including sexual health. And the questions that we designed in our survey were driven by women's priorities. And so we asked a number of questions about not just whether or not women were having sex, but whether that sex was pleasurable, satisfying, who it was with, and the dynamics of that relationship. So, so you bring up a couple of great questions. First, I'll answer that last bit. We don't have a control, which perhaps in this case would be women not living with HIV, but we recently submitted a grant to do that. But the other, I think, point that you highlight is how sexuality is subjective, right? What's enjoyable for one might not be enjoyable for another. And at the same time, our perceptions and evaluations of our sexual lives are also really shaped by societal circumstances. So what I think, the satisfaction that I have over my sex life might really depend on the stigma that I'm experiencing in my life. Maybe I'll be more satisfied without sex because having it leads to painful, stigmatizing experiences. It's complicated. Mm-hmm.
What do you hope to do with the results of your study? It sounds like it could have genuine social impact in a disadvantaged group.
Thank you for that question. We think so too. So my team and I, which includes women living with HIV, as well as researchers, have come together to build an online resource called lifeandlovewithhiv.ca. You can go there, sign up to be notified when our site launches. But the aim behind this website is to create a safe space where women living with HIV and couples can share their stories about sex and intimacy and love in a positive and affirming safe space. And it's backed by feminist research. So we hope to not only provide a space where women and couples feel less alone, but also to try and use our science to affect change and reduce stigma in society.
Alrighty, thank you so much.